The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's New Report webinar series. This webinar series features presentation by senior Army leaders responsible for key programs and initiatives. It also features contemporary military authors who weave together the past, present, and future story of the United States Army. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Leadership and Education, Lieutenant General Retired Les Smith.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Noon Report. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We appreciate your support as partners in defense of our nation. Joining us today to discuss his book, Degrade and Destroy, the inside story of the war against the Islamic State, from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, is author Michael R. Gordon. For those joining us today, please take advantage of having Mr. Gordon here today to ask questions. You can use the question and answer tab on the right side of your screen to submit a question. After the discussion, we will take as many questions as possible. You can also find the full bio for Mr. Gordon and for our moderator, Dr. Seth G. Jones, in the Handouts tab. As stated, the moderator for today's discussion is Dr. Seth Jones. Dr. Jones is Senior Vice President, Harold Brown Chair, Director of International Security Program, and the Director of the International Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. He also teaches at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the Center for Homeland Defense and Security at the Naval Postgraduate School. Prior to joining CSIS, Dr. Jones was Director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation. The author of multiple books and numerous articles, Dr. Jones specializes in irregular warfare, counterterrorism, and covert action. Dr. Jones, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, General Smith. I have the distinct honor to welcome Michael R. Gordon. He's the National Security Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and was Chief Military Correspondent for the New York Times, where he worked from 1985 to 2017. He's also the co-author with the late retired General Bernard Traynor of 3 fantastic and definitive histories of the US's war in Iraq: The Endgame, Cobra II, and the General's War. Welcome, Michael, and we look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you very much, Seth. Thank you, General Smith, and thank you to you, the audience. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. You know, I've given a number of talks and I've been involved in discussions about the book, but it's very rare that I have an opportunity to talk to a group like this, which are people who are not only students of military history, but have actually made history themselves and been part of these conflicts that I've chronicled for all these years. And I really couldn't have done this without the kind of access that I did have to military forces and all the various conflicts in the Middle East and beyond. You know, this month there's a lot of attention on what happened in the conflict in Afghanistan, and there are any number of postmortems. The militaries, the Pentagon is doing one, the media is doing them. They're all trying to divine the lessons of a conflict that I think most people would consider to have been a strategic defeat. But the book I wrote was about a war that we won by any reasonable standard, Operation Inherent Resolve. ISIS's caliphate was destroyed. The cost to the United States in terms of lives lost was minimal, on the order of 20 KIA. The U.S. is not an occupying power. It doesn't carry that burden. And even today we have only a modest presence in the region, 2,500 troops in Iraq and some 900 in Syria, and we're not making the mistake this time of removing the forces and letting the adversary come back again. The costs were much higher for our partner forces in Iraq and Syria, and too many civilians were harmed in the conflict, and there are lessons to be learned there. And there are also lessons from this conflict to be learned for the future. I think there's a bit of an attitude in some parts that this is just history, the war against ISIS, been there, done that. We've moved on to China, Russia, great power competition, integrated deterrence, and the like. But I argue that what happened in the counter-ISIS campaign has applicability to wars of the future, particularly in the ungoverned spaces in the world where the threats are sure to emerge again. Now, there's sort of several points that I try to get across in this book, which took me 6 years, but I did have a day job at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times while I was doing it. And one is that I tried to capture how the strategy and the operational concepts were developed during the war. When President Obama sent forces back to Iraq, there was no ready-made strategy. The White House had not anticipated that Mosul would fall and that we would have to go back to sending troops to advise and support the Iraqi forces. And so a lot of this was done on the fly over a period of years. And I tried to explain all the really important steps that had to be done. For example, when the U.S. forces initially were initially sent back as advisors, except for special operation forces, they were confined within the perimeter of large bases. They weren't out in the field with the Iraqi troops or the Peshmerga. They were doing remote advising. And that's how it went for about 2 years. It took a good 2 years when Joe Votel became the CENTCOM commander before the commanders were given the authority to send advisors with Iraqi forces at the battalion level. And that proved to be absolutely essential to make the campaign work. So there's a lesson to be learned in what it takes to make advising successful. Second, when the campaign began, there was not a coherent command structure. There was an arson effort in Iraq. There was airstrikes in Syria. There was no commander who could control both operations in Syria and Iraq and pull it all together. That happened under then Defense Secretary Ash Carter, and Lieutenant General Sean McFarland was the guy that pulled that together. It was never seamless in the end. He didn't have direct control over special operations forces. He had more of a red card where he could veto things if he thought they were not going the way he thought they needed to go, but by and large it worked. And so a command structure was built, expeditionary advising was introduced, and then a third important thing that happened is the air campaign evolved during the course of the war. Initially it was very much focused on tactical targets along the front line, and it took some period of time before the Air Force was able to persuade the CENTCOM to give them sufficient control of the ISR to identify deeper targets, bulk storage, banks, ISIS fuel trucks, ISIS command and control, and the like. None of that was in place the day U.S. forces started fighting ISIS in 2014, but all those things were in place by the end of 2016. And so part of what I tried to tell in the book was a story of how that happened, and as in any war, is a bit of a learning experience. Now, another big point I sought to make in the book was about the nature and the importance of the U.S. advisory role. And some people have asked me, could this have been done without the U.S.? And the answer is absolutely not. It wasn't just that we needed advisors to call in airstrikes and coordinate military operations with our partner forces, but the advisors really were the glue that held the operation together. I mean, think about the array of partners that we had. The Iraqi security forces, they're not one thing. There's the Iraqi army, there's the counterterrorism service, there's the federal police. They don't all work together normally, and they report to different ministries. There's the Kurdish Peshmerga. There are different Kurdish political parties, the KDP, the PUK. The Delta Force had to have branches in each camp in order to coordinate its operations. In Syria, there wasn't a partner at all. That had to be created from scratch. They became the Syrian Democratic Forces. The backbone was the YPG, a group that the U.S. had no interaction with prior to the onset of Operation inherent resolve. And so advisors not only helped these individual forces work together, they enabled them to cooperate to the extent they had to. When the battle for Mosul came, and I'm going to show you a photo there that was taken by now Brigadier General Pat Work, which is basically saying welcome to the caliphate from Mosul. There was it was imperative that Iraqi forces, the CTS, pass through Peshmerga lines. All of that was worked out in by the Americans at all various levels. It would never have happened if there hadn't been an American role in coordinating the campaign. Now, there's some important lessons to be learned, and which I saw firsthand, about the advisory effort, and which is that when you're an advisor, when you have partner forces, when you're doing what's called by, with, and through, by, the partner forces are doing the fighting, with, the U.S. and coalition partners are providing the air and other support, and through a policy and legal framework. When you're doing that, you can't dictate to the partner forces who are doing the bulk of the fighting and the dying. You can't order them around. They have their own politics, they have their own traditions, they have their own sense of strategy. And what I chronicle in the book is how the U.S. had to take that into account. There were times when there were entire battles that the U.S. wished had never occurred. Fallujah is an example. The U.S. wanted to move straight to Mosul, but it was important for the Iraqis. They were doing the fighting. Fallujah is close to Baghdad. U.S. had to acquiesce in that. There were times the U.S. didn't get what it wanted. And I'm going to show you a slide right now of the fight for East Mosul. Initially, the Americans had a concept, the 101st Advisors, of how that battle should unfold. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to take Iraq's counterterrorism service, the Iraqi army, and the federal police and make them kind of a combined effort and have a number of different axes, but with this mix of forces. The theory was the counterterrorism service would batter their way through, the Iraqi army would follow, and the federal police would stabilize. Well, the Iraqis would have no part of it. Each one of their forces wanted to do their own separate war, and that's how it came out. And what you see in that map there are all the separate lines of effort, not mutually supporting, poorly coordinated, and the consequence of that was that the fight for East Mosul turned out to be much harder than it was anticipated. I was covering that initially with the Peshmerga, then for the New York Times, and it was hard right from the start. And there was even an enormous setback there where Iraq's lone armored division, the 9th Armored Division, had a devastating episode when it took the Al-Salam hospital in East Mosul and was routed by Al-Qaeda and by ISIS, and had to retreat. So sometimes the U.S. couldn't call the shots. It could try to influence things, but it couldn't always win. But the situation was very different when we get to West Mosul, which is what I'm turning to now. And by that time, the principal advisory role had been handed off to the 82nd Airborne, and Pat Work, now Brigadier General Pat Work, was the advisor to Abdul Amir, who was the Iraqi commander. And in the early part of the fight for West Mosul, the Iraqis were stymied. They were all coming up from the south. ISIS had anticipated the attack. They were well prepared. Everything was grinding along very slowly. And the Americans had to persuade the Iraqis to change their strategy. And this was not easily done because they had to persuade the Iraqi Prime Minister and the Iraqi High Command to take the very same division that had been routed in East Mosul and use it to open up a northern front and go back into the city. And there wasn't embedding, unfortunately, in this conflict, but there was a practice called battlefield circulation. And I was on a battlefield circulation with General Steve Townsend in Haman on Alil, where we were meeting with various commanders when, unbeknownst to him and certainly to me, the Iraqi Prime Minister showed up and they had a full-blown council of war, which I was able to monitor inside an enormous tent. And there was a spirited debate among the Iraqis about what to do in East Mosul, and the Iraqi prime minister said he had no intention of sending the 9th Armored Division back in to open that northern front. Well, within a matter of weeks, the Iraqis were doing just that, and that's because the Americans had shared intelligence with them about why that would hold down their losses, and various interventions were made at all levels of the command to persuade them this was actually in their best interest. Well, how did that come about? There was a phrase that Pat Work uses, and I think it sort of speaks for himself. He said, deposit, 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 and then you make a withdrawal. And what he meant is he was going to be there with Abdul Amir to supply air support, to supply intelligence, to help him with logistics, armored bulldozers, whatever they needed. U.S. even participated in some of the combat, although in Washington they said we weren't in combat. General Townsend authorized U.S. troops to engage in combat with javelin and tow missiles to give them a little extra push. But by being there with the Iraqis when they needed it, there were times when the U.S. was able to go to them quietly, behind the scenes, not publicly, and say, hey, you need to think about doing this a little bit differently, and U.S. and coalition advisors are going to be there to help. That was an episode that I actually observed firsthand, and it turned the tide in the battle for West Mosul, which was the climactic battle of the war. Now, it was a big war. Mosul was not the end of it. There was a whole separate campaign in Syria for Raqqa, which was carried out primarily by the Delta Force and the 5th Special Forces Group known as Task Force 9 and Task Force 9.5. And we can talk about that in the Q&A. But at the end of the day, the caliphate was done. But the operation is not over. And in the final climactic battle for Baghouz, where ISIS was really, the physical caliphate was put to an end, thousands of ISIS families, ISIS fighters, streamed out of that village in the middle Euphrates River Valley. They're in the Al-Hol camp in Syria to this day, tens of thousands of them. Some of them innocent, some of them not so innocent. The world doesn't need know what to do with them. There are also a whole archipelago of prisons in which ISIS fighters are still kept in detention. ISIS still tries to break them out occasionally. Just a few weeks ago, there was a drone attack that the U.S. carried out to kill an ISIS commander. So the United States achieved a victory with its partners who paid a high cost, but this operation is not over. And most Americans have never even heard of it. Operation Inherent Resolve exists to this day, and there are still American forces in Iraq and Syria to engage in what is essentially a mopping up campaign, but to keep a lid on a very still volatile situation. So thank you for letting me give this presentation, and now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Seth Jones, who's going to ask all the hard questions that I didn't directly engage in this talk, and I appreciate your listening to me.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for walking us through the book. To the audience, please make sure you ask questions. This next segment will include both questions that I'll ask and questions from you, the audience. One of the things that I enjoyed about reading the book was that it really is a fluid, well-written history of what is a successful, or at least largely successful, operation to retake territory both in Syria and Iraq away from the Islamic State. In addition, I think the first-hand accounts, both based on Michael's trips to the region and the theater in combat, as well as his interviews with primary sources, makes this really, I think, the definitive account right now of the campaign against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So congratulations. It's really a superb book. It's also the fourth book on conflicts in and around Iraq that Michael has written, but it is the first without his longtime co-author, Lieutenant General Bernard Traynor. So, Michael, my first question really is, can you tell us how much he meant to you historically, meant to you and your research as you wrote several books, and what you did differently without him for this most recent book, Degrade and Destroy?
Well, Mick Traynor meant a lot to me, and he played an absolutely essential role in the first 3 books we did, and we wrote them together. And writing books is a very lonely experience, as you know, and it's really important to have someone who you can talk over ideas with and think about what things you really need to dig into deeper. You know, I've been in 7 wars on the ground, from Chechnya to these Iraq wars to Afghanistan to dating back to Just Cause, but I've not been in the military. Mick Traynor was a 3-star Marine general who had done 2 tours in Vietnam and Korea, and he was able to help me better understand the realities of military life, which I basically sampled in months-long embeds in these conflict zones. But the most important thing that I really learned from him was just basically how to approach these books. From the very start, our concept was we weren't trying to be the first book out of the gate. You know, there's a big push in journalism. You got to be first, you got to be fast, you got to be there before the other guy. Well, we said, okay, forget that. We're going to try to write the book that endures, that survives the test of time, that 5, 10, 15 years now people will return back to. That was the standard that we used. It's not always the best one for commercial success, but it's the one that I think made the project worthwhile. Not to be first, but to try to be the most accurate and as complete as you can be, you know, within the several years that we gave for each of these efforts.
Thanks. And those previous books also absolutely worth reading if you have not done so. They've looked at various components of wars in and around Iraq. Let me just go back before the campaign to target the Islamic State in both Syria and Iraq that you focused most of the attention of the book, and that is going back to the U.S. withdrawal in 2011. I asked the question in part because the U.S. in 2021 also withdrew from Afghanistan as well. So if you take us back to the decision-making up until the 2011 withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq, over the next few years, we do see a resurgence, first in al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then as it morphs into the Islamic State. What are the main lessons that you take? What were the challenges about that withdrawal that laid the groundwork for the Islamic State eventually to take the territory it controlled, that put the U.S. in the position that you're writing about here?
The withdrawal of U.S. forces in 2011 from Iraq was a strategic mistake, which put the U.S. in a more difficult position than it needed to be. But the responsibility is really a shared responsibility between the political leaders in Baghdad and in Washington. Nouri al-Maliki, who I interviewed for the book, was a very difficult customer and not an easy person to work with. And President Obama and Maliki certainly didn't forge much of a personal relationship during the SOFA talks. The two men only spoke twice, to start the talks and then to end the talks, to end them in failure, when they couldn't agree on a diplomatic understanding that would enable troops to stay. What happened in Iraq, I believe, was fundamentally a product of the problems in Iraq, not in the United States. The sectarian tensions, the policies of Maliki to disenfranchise the Sunnis. We're not responsible for that. This is indigenous factors that created an environment in which ISIS could gain traction. But the withdrawal of U.S. forces exacerbated the problem in several ways. One, we had less influence to push back on Maliki's sectarian behavior because we didn't have significant troops in country. We just had a nominal number of officers at the embassy and engaged in foreign military sales and some low-level training of the CTS. Two, we didn't mentor the Iraqi forces, and they deteriorated. No surprise, there were any number of briefings that that's exactly what would happen absent the U.S. presence. Three, the U.S. lost situational awareness of the own military we created, Iraqi security forces. And the reason Mosul came as a shock to President Obama and the White House was not that only that ISIS turned out to be more capable than Washington had anticipated, but also the U.S. had lost any insight and any awareness of what was happening inside the Iraqi forces and the extent to which they had deteriorated. It was the combination of the two that created the strategic surprise of the fall of Mosul, and all that would have been avoided if we had kept 5,000 troops in Iraq. ISIS may have still emerged, but we've been able to deal with it earlier.
And they may not have been able to take the territorial expanse that they did. On that point, and the broader point on the decision, it is interesting, and you point this out on page 384 of the book, that while the Obama administration had once refused to keep troops in Iraq unless the parliament endorsed a new status of forces agreement, if you fast forward to the Trump administration, the 2020 White House insisted that U.S. troops would stay no matter what the parliament wanted. So interesting, very different positions from different administrations on a status of force agreement and getting parliamentary buy-in in Iraq that you do point out near the end of the book.
Yeah, the failure to get Iraq to commit not only to negotiate a SOFA agreement but to submit it to its parliament is what led to the withdrawal of U.S. forces. However, after Mosul fell and after it became imperative to take on ISIS, the U.S. returned to Iraq without the benefit of a SOFA. And I know people in the administration just hoped the media wouldn't focus too much on it. So there's a lesson there. You can be a stickler for legal procedures when you're ambivalent about a deployment, but when an deployment becomes necessary, there are all sorts of legal workarounds to make it happen, and that's what happened in the case of OIR.
So I want to turn then to the war itself. One of the things that you argue at the beginning and throughout the book, and then you conclude with it, is that the campaign against ISIS or the Islamic State was a new campaign with proxy forces, U.S. advisors, U.S. and allied helicopters, AC-130 gunships, and an armada of warplanes, including fixed-wing aircraft. As you write, quote, "It was the new face of Middle East warfare for United States that had grown weary of sacrificing so many of its own in seemingly unending confrontations with militant groups," end quote. Now, some might push back a little bit on the newness of this and point to the overthrow of the Taliban regime in 2001 or the 2011 overthrow of the Gaddafi regime in 2011, or the kind of the historical Green Beret focus on unconventional warfare and foreign internal defense, or FID, which is quintessentially about by, with, and through partner forces, whether they're state or non-state. So from your perspective, what ends up being new here, and what ends up being different kind of evolutions from previous campaigns?
Well, that's a good point, Seth. And I had certainly seen earlier by, with, and through efforts. I was at Tora Bora. There was, obviously, we were working with the various warlords there against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda during the Iraq War, embedded with any number of what then called MIT teams, advisory teams that work with the Iraqi army. I did that in Mosul, Haditha, and Fallujah. So there are previous instances in which U.S. had advised large partner forces. But what was really unique about this thing was the scale of it. I mean, you're talking about an operation that encompassed two countries, Iraq and Syria, that involved multiple partners, in which the U.S. did not really deploy combat forces. Yes, SOF did some fighting, and there were some limited episodes when conventional forces picked up a javelin, but the main ground fighting was done almost entirely by the partner forces. And this was done by harnessing enormous amounts of air power, which is one reason Mosul and Raqqa look like they did do today, and intelligence. So I think it's the scale, the ambitious nature of the operation, and the fact that by and large it precluded the use of ground combat forces on the U.S. side and was so heavily dependent on partner forces to see the campaign through. I don't think anything quite like that has been done again, and done before, and I think variations of it could be done again if newer threats emerge in the Middle East or in other areas, particularly since so much of the focus of conventional forces is going to be on the China-Russia problem.
Michael, I want to ask a question about authorities, which you brought up, and then I want to go to one of our first questions from the audience about partner forces. But let me start with accompanying authorities. The Obama administration was hesitant, as you point out early on, to let advisors accompany Iraqi and Peshmerga forces into the field and also cap the number of special operations forces in Syria in particular. And even during the Mosul fight, as you just outlined, the U.S. was cautious about deploying advisors onto the battlefield and was essentially, at various points, mentoring from a distance. It took pushes from the military, including the Tactical Directive Number 1, to really loosen restrictions over time. So can you talk a little bit about this back and forth challenge of authorities, where the U.S. military ended up in Iraq and Syria, and what, if any, lessons do we take from that?
Well, I think what happened is the Obama administration had been pretty determined to turn the page on Iraq, and it was a rude shock when they had to go back in to take on ISIS. And in the White House, I think there was almost as much concern about getting in too deep as there was about stopping ISIS. It really took the terrorist attacks in Paris to galvanize the administration to take more risks. But in the process, there were sort of two sets of restrictions. One were kind of numerical, the number of boots you could have on the ground, the BOG number. And so there was a force manning level, and all sorts of games had to be played in order to get things done. If a guy came in, a guy had to go back to Arifjan, or some of the deployments that were taken in Iraq were TDY. They were less than 4 months. They didn't count against the limit. There was a bit of a shell game went on as the military tried to work within these numbers. Now, from the White House perspective, they were trying to keep a handle on the conflict and not let it slide into a quagmire. But there was a bit of a tension as commanders bumped up against these limits. One of the benefits, perhaps one of the few benefits of the Trump administration's oversight of the war was when H.R. McMaster was the National Security Advisor. He dispensed with these kind of limits. But there was a phase even at the end of the war where the Obama administration put a restriction. There could be 3 helicopters in Syria for 72 hours at any one time, and then they had to go back to Erbil. This was greatly frustrating to General Townsend, but from the White House perspective, they were a little nervous about getting deeper involved in Syria. There were also constraints on where advisors could go initially. Initially, they were not allowed to accompany forces, Iraqi forces, into the field. Now, they were still not supposed to get involved directly in the fray, but that was relaxed over time, as you point out, most famously by Tactical Directive Number 1 by General Townsend, which gave advisors more latitude on the battlefield and enabled them to directly call in airstrikes, which they were not able to do prior. It all had to be routed through a command center in either Erbil or Baghdad.
So this does bring us to the broader issue, because that was about accompanying authorities in part and numbers of boots on the ground. That whole approach was designed to support, on the Iraqi side, Iraqi forces, including the counterterrorism service forces. On the Syrian side, it was YPG, SDF forces, including Syrian Democratic Forces. So the first question from the audience is, in what important ways was the U.S. able to influence the strategy of its partner forces? And I realize here it's kind of a complex mix of different partner forces, including in different countries here. and how did it succeed in doing so? So that's one side of this. And on the other side, when was the U.S. unable to influence the strategy of its partner forces, and what were the implications?
Well, I gave one example of how the U.S. influenced the Iraqis in the battle for West Mosul when it persuaded Prime Minister Abadi, General Abdullah Mir, the Iraqi High Command to open up a northern front and to use the 9th Armored Division as the main element in it. That was something that was an American idea, but the Iraqis had to be persuaded of the wisdom of it. They couldn't be directed. It had to be explained to them, including through intelligence briefings about how that would benefit them. So that's an example. There's some interesting examples of how the partner forces influenced the U.S. And one big example is the fight for Raqqa, because when it came to Raqqa and the U.S. was trying to take that back from ISIS, there was an enormous amount of firepower applied. ISIS wasn't leaving. Civilians were crowded together with ISIS. And at that time, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis had promulgated what he called the annihilation doctrine, that we were going to surround cities and not let anybody out and not make sure that no terrorists escaped. Well, in the middle of this Raqqa drama, the sheikhs from that area went to General Mazloum, the SDF commander, and he said, oh, this is putting civilians who are already greatly in harm's way at too great a risk. You're really going to destroy the city to save it. We're losing the support of the population. You've got to call a halt and let ISIS leave. And General Mazloum went to Jeff Van Antwerp, the Delta commander in Syria, made the case. He accepted it. And so what happened then, not widely advertised by the Pentagon, but known, is the U.S. brokered or was party to an agreement where ISIS was allowed to leave Raqqa, go deeper into the middle Euphrates River Valley, and U.S. caught up with them with the SDF later on in Baghouz, but the annihilation strategy that Mattis had given a Pentagon press conference about was put aside. And in fact, it's an interesting cross-cultural thing where the SDF and our Middle East partners would say, what kind of army is it that surrounds a city with the enemy and doesn't leave them a way to get out? It was just a different way of looking at the problem. So there were those kind of interchange, and that was an instance in which it worked the other way.
So we have a question that I'll get to in a second from Jack about reconstitution of ISIS. But before we get there, I want to sort of lead up to it, which is, can you talk about how the counter-ISIS campaign was a success, and what are the ways that or factors that cause you to make that judgment? You do talk in the book about reduction in territorial control of ISIS. You talk about a reduced risk of ISIS external operations and counterterrorism capabilities. You talk a little about the low number of U.S. casualties. There may be other factors involved, but what constitutes in this case a success for you in looking at this particular campaign?
Well, ISIS doesn't have a caliphate. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has been killed. His successor's been killed. It's not nearly...
His successor has been now killed.
Yeah, has been killed. It's not really seen as a force that is active in plotting external operations as it did in Paris, in 2015. Now, I'm talking about ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Go over to Afghanistan, there's ISIS-K. That's a whole nother animal using the ISIS brand. There's ISIS elsewhere in the world. We've left Afghanistan. We don't have an effective over-the-horizon campaign unless an al-Qaeda leader decides to stay in a house and go out on the balcony periodically so we can observe them over a period of months and plan an attack. So I would say by any reasonable standard, no caliphate, no leader, not an external threat from Iraq and Syria, and but something that still requires watching. And every week the Pentagon Inspector General puts out a quarterly report on Operation Inherent Resolve, and yeah, there's fighting every month in Iraq and in Syria, but it's low level, and it's something which so far is pretty much under control.
Well, this does lead to Jack's question. Do you believe ISIS at some point has the ability to reconstitute in Iraq? And I'm going to add Syria to that as well, with U.S. presence, without. What factors might contribute to an ISIS resurgence in that region?
Well, I think if you step back from ISIS and just say Sunni militant groups, do they have, is it conceivable there could be another Sunni militant terrorist group in Iraq? And the answer is yes. I mean, look at the very fraught state of Iraqi politics. They can't even form a government. Maliki, astoundingly, has reemerged in Iraqi politics as a much more significant player than he was, and he's closer to Iran than we would like. So I think there's always that dynamic in Iraqi society and Syrian society for these kind of groups to emerge. That, you know, U.S. military force can't solve all the problems in the world, but the terrorist army that the United States set out to defeat in 2014 was by and large defeated.
Now, one thing that the U.S. did not do in Syria, particularly, and to some degree Iraq, was spend. This would be unlike Afghanistan. Spend a considerable amount of time, money, and effort on nation or state building. Once the bullets generally stopped flying. What is your sense about the thought process involved in not going down that road here, and the costs and benefits of doing that?
Well, all administrations have different voices in them, and the Trump administration was no exception, as we well know. And when H.R. McMaster was the National Security Advisor, he very much hoped there would be some sort of, not nation building, but what they called stabilization operations, which was some way of helping the people we liberated have some sort of livelihood, demining, things of that sort. And in fact, he had played a role in writing the Army operating concept, which called for a politically sustainable solution. Well, we didn't get that. And one reason we didn't get that is the president, A, it's inherently difficult, B, the president of the United States didn't buy into it. And he famously read an article in the Washington Post that the U.S. was spending all of $100 million in stabilization. Coalition partners were also spending money, and he canceled the program. And so the concept that McMaster had about maintaining a presence in Syria and stabilizing the areas, not nation building, was never really fully embraced by the commander-in-chief, who, well, twice ordered U.S. forces out of Syria only to reverse course when he was talked out of it, primarily by Jack Keane, the former vice chief of staff of the Army, on the grounds that this would hand over the oil to our adversaries. So the U.S. hasn't had a clear policy on stabilization, and the Biden administration, by and large, doesn't talk about Syria. So it's a bit on automatic pilot for now.
That is despite the fact that we continue to have U.S. forces in Syria, too, including ones, as you point out in the book and as you have pointed out in a Wall Street Journal piece, has coordinated with the Israelis on Israeli strikes in Syria. But let me get to my last question from Mick Bednarik, who says, thanks for this superb presentation. Fully agree on your fundamental premise of the importance of U.S. advisors across the Iraqi and KRG landscape. As you and I discussed years ago, the basic coordination and dialogue between the Iraqi security forces, CTS, federal police, Peshmerga, and the broader political disconnects was nearly insurmountable to achieve tactical success, much less strategic ends. So what's your perspective, he asks, of our U.S. policy way ahead, given the current issues impacting the Iraqi government, or lack thereof, and this is something we haven't gotten to yet, the Iranian proxies maintaining hold within the country, some of which, frankly, were involved in some of the operations you outlined, including Mosul. So way ahead.
Right. First, let me say, Mick Bednarik is a great guy who taught me a lot. I met him first in Bakuba during Arrowhead Ripper, which was an operation led by Steve Townsend in 2008, and again talked to him from this book because he was out there for a lot of it. I mean, some problems can't be resolved. They can only be managed. And at this stage, this is a problem that can be managed. It's certainly not going to be resolved through military force, but the absence of a U.S. military presence would make it worse. The Iranians are a big problem in Iraq and in Syria. It's a little quiet now, but it's perhaps not going to stay that way. And that's a different conflict, but one that certainly has the potential to draw the United States more deeply into some sort of, I don't know, select military operations in each of those countries. There have already been a few under President Biden retaliating against various Iranian-backed militias for strikes on U.S. troops. That's probably not going to go away even if they succeed in restoring the JCPOA in coming days.
Well, thanks, Michael. Appreciate your time here. Please remember to buy the book. I've got lots of underlines in it here, so I read it and appreciated the fluid reading, the prose, and the real serious documentation of the war, including some of the challenges in it. I will now turn the microphone back to General Smith for closing remarks, but thank you very much for being with us, Michael.
Great,
over to you, General Smith.
Wow, what a great discussion. Before we part, I want to inform you of a few upcoming events. On August 23rd, we will host a noon report on countering small unmanned aircraft systems with Major General Sean Gainey, Director, Joint Counter Unmanned Aircraft Systems, Office, Director of the Fires, G357, sponsored by Epirus. On 7 September, we'll host a noon report with a pivot to readiness with Lieutenant General R. Scott Dingle, the Surgeon General and Commanding General, U.S. Army Medical Command, and Command Sergeant Major Diamond Hu, Command Sergeant Major, U.S. Army Medical Command. I hope you can join us for an upcoming webinar. There are other great speakers scheduled. For more information of any of these events or to register, please visit our website at ausa.org. Finally, AUSA thanks all who support us with their membership. Membership matters. You help us support the Army. Thank you again for attending and have a great Army Day.